In the old days, when animals spoke with human tongues and wisdom moved freely across the land, there was one name spoken with both laughter and fear: Anansi, the spider who was too small to be mighty, yet too clever to be ignored. You may have heard his stories, how he outwitted stronger beasts, how he bent kings and spirits with nothing but words and tricks. Some admired him, others watched him carefully, because Anansi was wise, but his wisdom often wore the mask of deception. Elders say he taught the world how stories were born. They also say he taught the world how lies learn to walk. Listen closely, because this is not a tale of good or evil. It is a warning wrapped in laughter. Tell me, can cleverness become a curse? And what happens when trickery runs faster than wisdom? Our elders say a story is not something you hear, it is something you receive. It is carried by breath, guarded by memory, and released only when the night is ready. So draw closer, let the fire settle, let the drums slow their heartbeat. Before ink knew paper, before names were written, stories lived in the mouths of elders and traveled from village to village on moonlit roads. They were spoken beneath wide skies, where children listened in silence and adults pretended not to learn. These were not stories told for entertainment alone. They were instructions for living. The ancestors believed every tale had a spine. Bend it, and the meaning breaks. Among these stories, the name Anansi was never spoken carelessly. His tales were shared at dusk, when shadows grow long and truth becomes subtle. Elders used his stories to warn the young, not with anger, but with laughter. For laughter opens the ear where commands fail. The drums remember Anansi. The fire remembers him. Even the wind, passing through the trees, carries fragments of his name. They say his stories were whispered to teach caution, patience, and humility. They were reminders that intelligence without wisdom can wander into danger, and that clever words can build traps as easily as they open doors. So listen, as those before you listened, not with haste, but with respect, because this story has survived, not because it is amusing, but because it is true enough to endure. These events come from a time the elders described simply as the first days, when the world was still deciding what it would become. In those days, animals spoke as clearly as humans, and wisdom was not locked inside books, but walked openly along dusty paths. Knowledge did not belong to the powerful alone. It lived in the forest, in the river, and in the pauses between words. Villages rested at the edges of great forests, never daring to push too far inward. The people knew where safety ended and mystery began. Beyond the last hut, where cooking fires faded and the night grew thicker, rose the canopies of ancient trees, their roots twisted like old thoughts, and their branches stitched the sky together. This was not a forest to be conquered. It was a place to be respected. Paths ran through this world, but not all were meant to be followed. Some were walked only by elders. Others were reserved for spirits. A few were forbidden entirely, marked not by fences, but by silence. The people believed that every path carried memory, and stepping where one did not belong invited consequences that could not be undone. Humans, animals, and spirits lived in a careful balance. Animals were not lesser beings. They were teachers, messengers, and sometimes judges. Spirits moved unseen, but never absent, listening from riverbanks and termite mounds, weighing every action. Nothing happened without being noticed. Nothing was taken without being counted. It was into this ordered world that Anansi moved freely. The sacred forests were familiar to him. He climbed where others feared to look up, and he crossed boundaries with smiles and clever words. Where warnings stood, he found loopholes. Where rules were spoken, he listened for weaknesses. The people believed Balance held the world together like a woven mat. Pull one strand too hard, and the entire weave would loosen. Every action demanded an answer. Every gift asked for respect. And every clever choice, no matter how small, carried a shadow that followed behind. This was a world where consequences did not rush, but they never forgot. And so, within this world of balance and watching spirits, there lived a spider unlike any other. His body was small, his legs were thin, but his name traveled farther than the strongest lion's roar. Anansi. He was not feared for strength, nor respected for size. He was known for his mind, quick, sharp, restless. Where others relied on muscle or tradition, Anansi relied on thought, and he trusted that thought above all else. Among the animals, his presence brought mixed feelings. When Anansi approached, some leaned closer, eager for laughter, because his words could twist dull moments into clever games. Others stepped back, knowing that, wherever Anansi stood, someone else usually paid the price. He could solve problems no one else dared touch, but he solved them in ways that left questions behind. The elders say Anansi loved wisdom, but loved being known as wise even more. He collected clever ideas the way others collected food, storing them not to share, but to prove he had them. Each successful trick fed his pride. Each victory whispered to him that he was smarter than the rules that bound everyone else. Even the spirits watched him carefully. They saw how Anansi spoke sweetly to those stronger than himself, how he bowed just enough to appear humble, then rose with another plan already forming. They noticed how he laughed when others stumbled, and how quickly he claimed credit when fortune smiled. Warnings followed Anansi wherever he went, not shouted, whispered. Elders cautioned him to slow his tongue. Animals reminded him that cleverness was meant to serve the community, not the self. Even the forest seemed to pause when he passed, as though waiting to see what he would take next. But Anansi heard warnings the way one hears distant drums, interesting but easy to ignore. He believed intelligence was a shield no consequence could pierce. He believed every problem had a trick, and every rule had an opening. And most dangerously of all, he believed he could outthink fate itself. The elders say, destiny does not chase loudly. It walks patiently behind those who refuse to listen. It is said that Anansi's troubles did not begin with hunger or need. They began with desire. For all his cleverness, Anansi wanted more than survival. He wanted recognition. He wanted his name to rise higher than the treetops, higher even than the spirits who watched the world from above. To be clever was no longer enough. He wanted to be unmatched. In those days, the elders spoke of a great wisdom that did not belong to any one creature. Wisdom was shared, passed from mouth to mouth, from elder to child, from animal to animal. It was believed that wisdom, like fire, must warm everyone, or it would burn the one who tried to own it. Anansi did not agree. He watched how others struggled with choices he could solve quickly. He listened as animals argued over problems he already knew how to twist in his favor, and slowly a thought settled into his mind. Quiet at first, then bold. What if wisdom belonged to me alone? Some say it was the sky god himself who warned Anansi. Others say it was an elder spirit speaking through the rustling leaves. However it came, the message was clear. Wisdom was not meant to be gathered, stored, or hoarded. It was meant to move. Anansi listened, and then he smiled. With careful words and practiced humility, he began to collect wisdom wherever he found it. Lessons, proverbs, secrets, and truths. He gathered them not to share, but to keep. He convinced animals to give up their knowledge. He outwitted those who trusted him. Each success made him bolder. Each lie came easier than the last. When his collection grew too large to carry, Anansi placed all the wisdom he had stolen into a single vessel, believing that once it was hidden away, he would be wiser than gods and spirits alike. He chose secrecy over balance, control over harmony. In doing so, Anansi crossed a line that was never drawn, but always understood. The world did not react at once. The forest did not shout. The spirits did not strike. Instead, everything grew quiet, and in that silence, Anansi believed he had won, unaware that the weight he carried was already beginning to pull him toward a fate his cleverness could not escape. At first, Anansi's schemes appeared to succeed. With the vessel of gathered wisdom hidden close, he moved through the world with new confidence. His words grew sharper, his laughter grew louder. When disputes arose among the animals, Anansi stepped forward, offering solutions that favored him alone. And more often than not, his tricks worked. This was the first trial, and Anansi passed it easily. The tortoise, slow and thoughtful, was among the first to notice the change. He questioned Anansi's sudden certainty, his refusal to listen. Anansi only laughed, wrapping his words around the tortoise-like silk, convincing him that slowness was the same as foolishness. The animals laughed too, and the tortoise withdrew, silent but watchful. Anansi took this as proof of his greatness, but the second trial followed closely behind. As Anansi continued to manipulate those around him, his tricks began to leave marks. The bird, who once carried messages of wisdom between villages and forests, found herself deceived into delivering lies instead of truth. When confusion spread, Anansi blamed her wings for flying too fast. Trust fractured. Whispers replaced laughter. The leopard, powerful and proud, was next. Anansi promised him advantage, guiding him into a plan that ended with the leopard blamed for a theft he did not commit. Though the leopard escaped punishment, his name did not. Strength, it seemed, could not protect reputation from clever deceit. Still, Anansi celebrated. Each victory felt like confirmation that rules were for others, that consequences were myths told to frighten the weak. What he did not see, or refused to see, was how the circle around him widened. Animals no longer gathered when he spoke. Spirits listened more closely. Even the forest paths seemed to twist away from his feet. Then came the third trial. Confident beyond caution, Anansi attempted his boldest trick yet, one meant to prove that even the wisdom he carried could not weigh him down. But this time, the deception folded inward. The vessel he trusted shifted. The balance he ignored failed him. What had once felt like power became burden. In trying to rise above all others, Anansi found himself caught, his own cleverness tightening like a web spun too fast, too tight. The animals watched from a distance now, not amused, not angry, only certain that something had changed. Anansi still smiled, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. And for the first time, the world did not move the way he expected it to. It was then, in the quiet moments between the rustling leaves and the distant calls of the night, that Anansi began to notice something he had never expected. The spirits were not angry, not yet. All his careful planning, all his clever words, all the laughter he had earned, they were not rewards. They were tests. Every deception, every trick, every stolen piece of wisdom had been a measure, a mirror held up to show him the shape of his heart. And the mirror had begun to tremble. For the first time, Anansi realized that wisdom was not something to be taken, stored, or owned. It was like water in a river, flowing freely, carrying life and lessons along its course. Attempting to trap it in a single vessel, to bend it to his will, was as futile as holding the wind in your hands. And yet, the spirits allowed him to continue. They watched as he moved through the forest, confident, proud, believing he had won. But in their patience lay a quiet power. The consequences were coming, though they had been delayed, invisible in their approach. The very tricks he had woven began to turn back toward him. The lies he had told crept into unexpected corners. The animals he had deceived whispered behind his back. Even the trees seemed to shift, guiding him unknowingly toward his own undoing. Anansi had thought himself cleverer than all, but cleverness, it seemed, could be a double-edged thread, woven into a web that would catch its own maker. This was the twist the elders spoke of, the lesson hidden in laughter, that even the most cunning could be ensnared by the cleverness they believed was their gift. And so, what appeared to be a victory began to unravel, softly at first, like the first drops of rain signaling a coming storm. Anansi laughed still, but it was a different laughter now, less certain, tinged with a question he could not yet answer. Had he truly outwitted the world, or had he only begun the game it had set for him? By the time the sun began to hide behind the distant hills, Anansi felt the weight of all he had done. The vessel of wisdom he had hoarded pressed against him not as a prize, but as a chain. The forest itself seemed to lean closer, observing, listening, judging. Every tree, every whispering leaf, every shadow became a reminder that cleverness alone could not save him. Anansi had come to the edge of a choice that no clever trick could navigate. Pride demanded that he cling to what he had stolen, that he continue to prove his superiority. Humility, though, spoke in a softer voice, the voice of the elders, the animals, the spirits, and the rhythm of the world itself. It asked him to release the vessel, to return wisdom to where it belonged, to admit that even a mind as sharp as his was bound by the rules he had ignored. The animals gathered quietly. The tortoise watched from a nearby stone. The bird perched high in the canopy, and the leopard's golden eyes glinted in the shadows. Even they seemed to hold their breath, knowing that the outcome would change the balance of the forest. Anansi weighed his options. Pride whispered of fame, of laughter, of stories told about his unmatched cunning. Humility whispered of survival, not of body, but of spirit. He could keep his hoard and risk losing everything he valued: trust, freedom, respect. Or he could let go, risk shame, and perhaps find favor with the world he had tried to control. For a long moment, the forest was still. Not a leaf stirred, not a bird called, not a drum beat. And then the moment came. The choice could no longer be postponed. There was no clever twist left to manipulate, no words left to weave. The consequences were immediate, irreversible. Whatever Anansi decided in that moment would shape his place in stories forever. For the first time, the spider realized that wisdom and power were not rewards to claim. They were tests to endure. And every trick, every clever word, every stolen lesson was now a reflection back on him. In the silence before action, it became clear there was no turning back. No cunning, no laughter, no web of words could escape the moral weight he had carried into the forest. Anansi had reached the point of no return. In the end, Anansi survived. His body was as small as ever, and his legs carried him across the forest as lightly as before. But the spider who walked among the trees that day was not the same as the one who had hoarded wisdom so boldly. The cleverness that had once made him feared and admired now carried a weight he could not shake, a quiet reminder that pride, even cloaked in intelligence, can have consequences that outlast laughter. The animals, the spirits, and the elders watched closely. Balance had returned to the forest, not because Anansi had been defeated in battle, but because he had been shown the limits of his cunning. The tortoise resumed his cautious pace through the forest. The birds carried messages of truth once more. and the leopard roamed freely, his dignity restored. The world had whispered its judgment, and Anansi had felt it in the subtle, unrelenting ways only the cleverest could understand. From that day, Anansi became both legend and lesson. He remained a trickster, not because he refused to learn, but because cleverness, when unchecked, has a way of enduring. Stories carried his name forward through generations, shared by firesides, whispered under moonlit skies, sung in drumming rhythms. Children laughed at his cleverness. Adults shook their heads at his deceit. Every tale reminded the listener that intelligence without humility is a fragile thing, that every trick may one day return to its maker, and that the balance of the world watches even when eyes seem not to see. And so, Anansi lives in memory, in story, in the very laughter and caution that keep the lessons of the forest alive. He survived, but forever changed, and through him, the forest, the animals, and the spirits reminded all who listened, cleverness can win the moment, but wisdom governs the long path. From Anansi's story, there is more than laughter to remember. There is guidance, lessons carried through the mouths of elders, the rustle of leaves, and the whispers of the forest. Cleverness alone is not enough. It must serve wisdom, not pride. Intelligence without humility isolates. It may win moments, but it severs trust, fractures relationships, and leaves the clever one alone in the end. Shortcuts, though tempting, leave consequences in their wake, unseen threads that may return when least expected. Anansi's hoarding of wisdom seemed harmless at first, but every trick, every lie, every moment he chose cleverness over care, created ripples that reached far beyond his intent. Listen closely, for these lessons are not bound to the forest or the animals. They walk with you in daily choices, in how you speak, how you act, how you navigate trust and power. They remind us that manipulation may succeed in the moment, but wisdom requires patience and humility. That cleverness, when guided by humility, can inspire and protect, but when guided by pride alone, it isolates and harms. Let Anansi's laughter be a mirror, not a goal. Let his mistakes be warnings that echo through time, urging you to temper your intelligence with care, your ambition with conscience, and your actions with respect. For the balance of the world is measured not in clever victories, but in the lasting harmony we leave behind. Take a moment and consider your own path. Every day, in ways both small and great, you face choices like those Anansi faced long ago, moments where cleverness tempts you, where pride whispers that you are above the rules, and where shortcuts seem easier than patience. These are your Anansi moments, and they test not only your mind, but the strength of your character. Wisdom is not a gift granted by others. It is a choice, quietly offered in the silence when no one is watching. It is in the decisions we make when no applause follows, when no eyes are upon us, and when the consequences may not arrive for a long time. The forest, the rivers, the animals, and the unseen watchers of the world remind us what we do in private shapes the life we carry in public. Let Anansi's story live within you not as mere entertainment, but as a mirror. Let it remind you that cleverness alone does not define greatness, that humility strengthens intelligence, and that true wisdom is shown in restraint, respect, and the courage to do what is right, even when it is not easy. Every choice, every word, every action carries weight, and every day you are given the chance to act with foresight, honor, and integrity, just as Anansi once had, and just as the world watches still. Now, as the fire dims and the shadows stretch long across the forest floor, remember that these stories live only as long as they are told. Walk with us again, return to the fire, and listen to the lessons that the elders and ancestors have preserved for generations. Subscribe, share, and keep the stories moving from one listener to the next, so that Anansi's laughter, his wisdom, and his warnings are never forgotten. In doing so, you honor the ancestors, the forests, and the voices that have carried these tales across time, reminding us all that the lessons of the past guide the choices of the present. Come back to the fire. Let the stories continue. Let the ancestors speak through each word.